Get started in a few minutes once everyone has joined. In just a moment, rather. All right, well, welcome. Welcome to all of you to this webinar discussion on how a revamped U.S. trade policy could rise to global challenges. This event is co-hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center, the GDP Center, is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, was established in 1964 as an intergovernmental organization intended to promote the interests of developing states in world trade. Today, it is the arm of the United Nations Secretariat that deals with trade, investment, and development issues. My name is Rachel Thrasher. I'm a researcher at the GDP Center and a professor at Boston University School of Law, where I teach courses in international trade regulation. The Biden administration recently shared an ambitious vision for worker-centered trade policy to tackle the global race to the bottom, build resilience in domestic supply chains, and strengthen trust in the multilateral trading system. Meanwhile, a broad range of World Trade Organization members have been pushing for deeper reform within the international trade architecture for some time now. For some members, it's about fulfilling the promises of the Doha Development Round, which was never fully completed. For others, it has been about getting the dispute settlement mechanism and appellate body, which have been effectively shuttered, up and working again. For some, it is a conflict between multilateralism and plurilateralism, while for still others, it is a conflict between China and all that it represents and the world. As a recent research paper from UNCTAD outlines, the current trade regime has yielded key trends that are ripe for reform: a deepening of inequalities, a growing dominance of big firms, and scant economic benefits of liberalization and enduring boom and bust cycles. It argues that while the common wisdom suggests that free trade is better than its alternative, looking closely at the data shows a persistent negative trend. In all, the architecture of trade and investment rules have served as a barrier to the ambitious industrial transformation required to decarbonize the global economy and keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Achieving climate, employment, and development goals will depend on a reform agenda that unites the interests of advanced and developing economies, creating decent jobs, locking in pathways to deep decarbonization, and diversifying and strengthening regional resilience. Such an alignment could deliver mutual benefits and advance the stated ambitions of the revamped U.S. trade policy. Unfortunately, the ongoing conversation too often pits advanced economies against developing countries and their need for policy space, which I have discussed in my recent book, Constraining Development. The Biden administration seems to be aware of this, that free trade is not the be-all, end-all for any country, even those with the highest per capita income. However, the tension and persistent challenge is to turn that awareness toward the interests of developing countries, to show the interdependency of all countries and the possibilities for a shared prosperity. In light of these developments, what should the key priorities be for the U.S. Trade Representative, Katherine and her team, to secure domestic and international goals? Will the new U.S. trade approach support the ambitions of developing countries in the global trade system? And what challenges are likely to hamper progress? Joining us to discuss this are four distinguished experts. Richard Kozel-Wright is an economist and the director of UNCTAD's Division on Globalization and Development Strategies. He has worked at the UN in both New York and Geneva and has published widely on economic issues. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge in the UK. Rolelwa Mlumbi Peter is ambassador for South Africa's mission to the World Trade Organization. She has served as South Africa's chief negotiator and deputy director general in the International Trade and Economics Division at the Department of Trade and Industry since 2014. She has led South Africa's trade negotiations with various partners, including the European Union, the UK, and Mercosur. At the regional and continental level, she has led trade negotiations and bilateral and regional trade engagements in the Southern African Customs Union, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, the Tripartite Free Trade Area negotiations between the East African Community, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and the SADC, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Damon Silvers is the Director of Policy and Special Counsel for the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO. He joined the AFL-CIO as Associate General Counsel in 1997. Prior to working for the AFL-CIO, he worked for the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers, the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, and as a law clerk at the Delaware Court of Chancery. He also serves on a pro bono basis as a Special Assistant Attorney General for the state of New York. He holds a Juris Doctor with honors from Harvard Law School and an MBA with high honors from Harvard Business School. Tim Meyer is a professor of law and director of the International Legal Studies program at Vanderbilt Law School. He's an expert of public international law with specialties in international trade, investment, and environmental law. His current research examines how international economic agreements relate and respond to concerns about economic opportunity and inequality, and the role of the constitutional separation of powers in U.S. economic policymaking. He earned his BA and MA in history from Stanford University and a JD and PhD in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California, Berkeley. Before we turn this over to our panelists, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording will be immediately accessible. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask questions for the panelists, and please also give your name and affiliation when you are entering your question. We will take those questions after the panelists' remarks, but you can feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion. Thank you for joining us today, and over to you, Richard.
Rachel, thank you very much. Thanks to the Center for organizing today's seminar. I'm going to talk in this 6 or 7 minutes I have just to give a flavor of the paper that you have, I hope, put on the chat there, which is a paper I co-authored with a number of colleagues, mainly from UNCTAD. And I just want to try and tease out some of the messages that we have in that paper. There's a couple of kind of broad influences on why we did this paper. The first one, of course, is the discussion on WTO reform that has picked up here in Geneva in recent months, and our feeling that developing countries were again in a reactive mode rather than having a kind of agenda setting position. And a couple of subtexts there. I think there's a frustration on our side in UNCTAD that we haven't ourselves been involved in setting a positive agenda on trade for some time. The last time we really did that was in the early 2000s, but very little has come out of UNCTAD, unfortunately, on this issue since then. The other kind of subplot here, of course, is a feeling that we have that the advanced economies have, to a pretty large degree, abandoned multilateralism as the basis for trade negotiations and have gone off in other directions, and that's had a chilling effect on the kind of constructive discussion that we want to see. The second kind of influence on the paper, of course, is the recovery, the questions around the recovery from COVID-19, and in particular whether this building back better world is a meaningful way of framing the challenge, or indeed whether business as usual will be the default position when the recovery begins to take hold, not only in the advanced economies but in developing countries too, where the recovery is not yet taking place. A couple of subtexts there. UNCTAD has done a lot of work on the global Green New Deal in this, thinking about issues around recovery. Trade has not figured very prominently in that discussion. I think this is a first foray into trying to think about the relationships, the role of trade in a global Green New Deal agenda. And of course, there's a issue that kind of speaks to the building the business as usual concerns about lessons from the global financial crisis that also is woven in some ways into the text that we put together. I should say, from our point of view, unfortunately, we see trade as hardwired into a business as usual agenda. Whatever the problem, at least in the constituency we and the Kalelwa swim in here, whatever the problem, more trade liberalization is usually the solution that we hear. And that's true of market fundamentalists or kind of trade technocrats too. And that's something that UNCTAD has consistently challenged in the work that we do, and that figures, I think, in this paper too. On the US position, which we don't address directly in the paper, I mean, and we're beginning to hear elements of that in our circles. Ngozi has met with Ambassador Tai recently to discuss some of these issues. There's a lot of talk about meaningful agreement. What meaningful means is still not quite clear to us. There are maximalist positions on fisheries subsidies and minimalist positions on special and differential treatment, at least to the extent that the Americans say, or the Group B, the advanced economies, believe that they have a right to say when developing countries need special and differential treatment and when they don't need special and differential treatment, which is not our understanding of the SDT agenda. There's also a kind of post-MC12 agenda emerging around market access, with a particular stress on more and stronger trade facilitation and liberalization, including in services and foreign direct investment issues. This to us sounds like a business as usual agenda. What we try and do in the paper is to lay out some of the elements of an alternative recovery plan for developing countries in which trade figures prominently. Obviously, the focus of any kind of recovery right now, and it's work that we've done extensively in our trade and development report, of course, involves the macroeconomic and getting the macroeconomic and financial agenda right. And that means avoiding any premature return to austerity and ensuring developing countries have adequate financial support at the multilateral level to be able to undertake the kind of fiscal responses that they need in the face of the crisis. I don't want to go into that. We've written extensively on that side of the story. In terms of I'm part of that story, and I think it speaks to some difficult issues in the trade agenda, of course, is our argument that ideally this should be a wage-led recovery. That's what we would like to see as the basis of any sort of alternative strategy. That's different, I think, from the issue around labor standards, and I think there is some tensions that we need to talk about between a wage-led growth strategy and a much narrower focus on labor standards, and perhaps that's part of the discussion today. Obviously, resilience is a kind of the word of choice at the moment, and putting resilience before profitability has certainly been something that's come out of the COVID crisis. We think that needs to be more hardwired into the trade architecture. We argue for peace clauses in response to all kinds of emergencies should be part of the WTO agenda. Obviously, the waiver on TRIPS rules is part of that and a first step, but one, I think we can apply that to other emergencies, whether that's health or food or indeed the debt emergencies which many developing countries are facing at the moment. So that kind of adding flexibility to the trade rules is a critical part of the resilience agenda as we see it. Obviously, the climate challenge, which itself has resilience features, is something that needs to be put into any sort of trade agenda and linked to the challenges around recovery. The paper suggests that the kind of market-friendly solutions that we've begun to hear about in recent months does not seem to be consistent with the common but differentiated responsibilities that are at the heart of the climate agenda, and somehow bridging that gap, we think, is going to be critical if we're going to make progress both on the trade front, where the environment question is very sensitive, but also in the context of the COP as well. Linked to that, I think, is the issues around industrial policy. We believe very strongly that any kind of recovery must have industrial policy at its center. That raises issues around the use of subsidies, which is a contentious issue, but also around the whole digital agenda and the need for some kind of development-friendly digital regime that is linked to the notions of recovery, and we don't see that in many of the discussions that are taking place so far in the context of the WTO. Clearly there's a lot of tensions in this kind of agenda. There are, I think, though, some common ground that we need to explore and build upon if we're going to get progress in the context of WTO reform. The first one is an obvious one. I think it's kind of obvious now to everyone that we don't look at trade as a standalone, siloed agenda, and we can't do that anymore. You know, the trading environment is not the kind of perfectly competitive environment that you find in economic textbooks for the reasons that you yourself mentioned in your opening remarks, Rachel. This is an environment dominated by very large players, a lot of asymmetric power relations, asymmetric information is part of that environment. And we should stop pretending that kind of models of perfect competition frame the way in which we think about trade. The trade agenda itself is not about trade any longer either, and that's become apparent to many people, that it's become much more expansive, has much more to do with regulatory and corporate practices than it ever did under the kind of the traditional GATT legislation. So the trade has changed in fundamental ways, and we need to recognize those changes and deal with them together. I think it does suggest a much more strategic approach to trade policy than has traditionally been the case. Policy space is no longer a kind of dirty word, I think, in the trade policy community, and it needs to be taken, I think, much more seriously, particularly by advanced economies. Developing countries have long complained about the reduction in their policy space. It's interesting now that advanced economies are beginning to talk about the reduction of policy space. The EU has dredged up the concept of strategic autonomy to kind of embrace this agenda. I think that's an area that we have in common and need to exploit. Clearly, distribution matters. You know, trade, this idea that trade was simply a win-win kind of issue, I don't think is any longer credible. The distributional consequences of trade, I'm sure Damon will talk about this, has become much more prevalent in discussions in recent years, and that's something that both advanced and developing countries share. And related to that, I think the recognition that corporate power is a major distortion on international trade that needs to be up front and center in any sort of discussions moving forward, and that means not just issues around global taxation, where we've seen progress, I think, in recent weeks, but serious discussion about the need for global competition policy, global antitrust policy. I think these discussions need to be had, and I think there would be plenty of common ground there in terms of a progressive trade agenda. And I think finally, and I'll just leave it with this point, and I think it's an area where we're seeing common ground. The need to see trade and the architecture of trade, international trade, in relationship to other elements of the multilateral trading system, I think needs to be pursued more aggressively. You can't do good trade without a good international financial system, and we don't have a very good international financial system at the moment, certainly not one that works to the advantage of developing countries. And the need to link the reform of the international trading system to reform of the international financial architecture is something that UNCTAD has worked on for a long time. The Global Development Policy Center has also is doing important work on, and I think that's an area where we can find a lot of common ground. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Richard. I believe Ambassador?
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thanks very much, Richard, for giving that outline. agree with many of the points that Richard has raised. But let me start by saying we need to really reflect on the role of the multilateral trading system, especially in the current context that we find ourselves in. The failure to control the COVID-19 pandemic will have far-reaching impacts. And we have seen, for example, in 2020, that it has led to a falling of the global GDP by 3.3%. We are aware that the global economy is now projected to grow. However, economic recovery is uneven, and we're hearing of the K recovery. Clearly, we are not building back better in terms of economic recovery or production, as well as in terms of access and rollout of vaccines. Unfortunately, the cost of all of this is borne disproportionately by developing countries, particularly those in Africa. While the global economy is now recovering, there are growing concerns that developing countries might face a lost decade, including challenges in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Everyone is aware that in order for us to recover in a sustainable way from the pandemic, we need equitable distributions of vaccines globally. Failure to do so will cost the global economy close to $9 trillion according to the ICC. And we are aware that this is much deeper than the 2008 financial crisis and its impact. So what this says to us is that we need a multilateral trading system that promotes solidarity. It must facilitate that we address common challenges in a fair and balanced manner. We must recognize the disproportionate impact of the pandemic to developing countries. Therefore, it's important that we preserve the key principles that underpin the WTO, which include special and differential treatment, as well as consensus decision-making. More importantly, we would need to have a multilateral trading system that goes back to achieving the goals that are set out in the Marrakesh Agreement, which include achieving full employment, enhancing living standards, as well as achieving sustainable development. This is in recognition of the fact that trade is not an end in itself, but a means to achieve these key goals that are set out in the Marrakesh Agreement. As Richard has said, developing countries have been calling for a reform agenda in the WTO that will broaden the benefits of the multilateral trading system and put the interests of developing countries at the center of the WTO work program. And this agenda was embodied in the Doha Development Agenda, and we are aware that those promises of the DDA remain unfulfilled. What COVID-19 has highlighted to us is the strategic vulnerability of developing countries and the critical importance of diversifying supply chains as well as production. This means that we need to give developing countries policy space to achieve their development objectives, both in terms of industrial development, but also in terms of structural transformation, so that they are not only locked in global value chains as suppliers of primary products, but are able to move up the value chain. And we have seen the importance of this even in the context of COVID-19 and vaccine manufacturing, because currently most of the manufacturing that is taking place in developing countries is in terms of fill and finish. So if we want to build resilience in terms of public health, developing countries should be able to move beyond fill and finish. And of course, the calls for a TRIPS waiver are therefore important because it will give the policy space for developing countries to be able to ramp up as well as diversify production of not only vaccines, but therapeutics as well as diagnostics. The US support, therefore, of the TRIPS waiver came at an opportune time, and I must say that it has assisted to give impetus to the negotiations. However, more is required so that we move into true text-based negotiations, and this would require active engagement by the US as well as other members so that we are able to conclude these negotiations as soon as possible. Our view is that the TRIPS waiver is central to any WTO response to the pandemic and is key to boosting production as well as diversifying production across the world. We also hear that the buzzword is resilience, as Richard has said. Our view, though, is that we need to build, of course, resilient economies. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. But I guess the question or answer differs as to how we achieve this objective. In our view, a multilateral trading system that contributes to resilient economies will be one that cultivates an appropriate balance between national development strategies as well as multilateral cooperation, so that we address the multifaceted challenges we all face alongside our specific contexts as well as policy imperatives. This calls for the need to widen spaces for members to be able to pursue their national development strategies in the broad framework and the principles that are set out in a rules-based trading system, so that we are able to industrialize and change the structure of our economies. We would also need members to work with developing countries so that we make the multilateral trading system more inclusive and development-oriented. Therefore, any reform agenda that is pursued in the WTO must address these core objectives and must also facilitate effective mechanisms to promote technology transfer, which has become actually more visible in terms of importance in the context of the pandemic, but also even beyond the health-related issues in terms of digitalization as well as climate mitigation measures. And if we are to achieve an inclusive system, we need to preserve the multilateral character of the WTO and avoid initiatives that will fragment the system. Together with India, South Africa has put forward a paper which is currently being discussed in the WTO, in the General Council, on the need to reflect on the legal status of the joint statement initiatives. And in that paper, we reflect on the systemic risks that are posed by the JSIs. And this is an issue that members are currently reflecting on. We also need to ensure that we reaffirm the principle of special and differential treatment. There is sometimes a tendency to indicate that the reason why the negotiating function of the WTO is not moving is because of SND. And I think if we reflect on what SND is, I think we need to really critically analyze that position by members. SND in the WTO has never been granted freely. It's always an outcome of negotiation. And in the WTO, all members, through the negotiation dynamics, have been able to take commitments that are commensurate with their level of development. In our view, SND is not an obstacle to the negotiating function. Actually, it assists members to calibrate the negotiated outcomes in line with their own realities. So it will be important, therefore, as we look at a multilateral trading system that promotes inclusivity and development, that we reaffirm the principle of SND. There is also the tendency to look and link the dysfunction of the WTO only to the appellate body and the fact that we have a dysfunctional dispute settlement system. We do agree with the need to ensure that we address this important issue in the WTO, and it will be important for all members to engage with a view to find a solution. But what I want to also emphasize is that the dysfunction of the WTO is not only limited to the appellate body, as important as that is, but it also extends to the inability to conclude negotiations, even on issues that are properly and multilaterally mandated, including those aspects that are under the Doha Development Agenda. And this is what contributes to a limited trust in the system and to inequitable outcomes out of the multilateral trading system. And we have seen, for example, limited progress in terms of addressing subsidies and trade distorting domestic support when it comes to agriculture, which is an issue or a sector of critical importance to many members of the WTO, including developing countries. So if we are to ensure that we have a system that delivers for all of us, the long outstanding issues would need to be addressed and delivered upon. Richard also referred to some of the issues that are also coming up in the context of COVID-19, and where the view of some is that the panacea to all our challenges in the WTO is further trade liberalization. We also see this in the context of COVID-19, where members are asked to liberalize tariffs, also new disciplines when it comes to export restrictions, even though in terms of the WTO, there are limitations in terms of use to export restrictions, and it's under very limited circumstances to deal with shortages of essential products, including food supplies, and of course, in the case of COVID-19, health supplies. And the disciplines are also clear in terms of how members should be invoking those in exceptional circumstances. So it will be important that developing countries are cautious about being asked to relinquish their required trade policy space, which includes permanent liberalization of tariffs in the context where they need to ensure that they have resilient health systems, including addressing the current strategic vulnerabilities, especially in Africa, that depends on 99% of imports when it comes to their own vaccine needs. So it's important that we look at preserving the policy space that we have to ensure that we're able to build resilient systems. So in conclusion, I think what will be important to take the WTO forward is for members to engage, to look at how we come up with a system that will work for all of us, not a system that will only preserve the interests of a few. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Mulumbi Peter. So wonderful to hear from you. I will pass this off to Damon Silvers.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And let me first say on behalf of the AFL-CIO, what an honor and pleasure it is to be at an UNCTAD event. You all have carried the flag for working people in profound ways for decades, and we're very grateful. Second, what an honor it is to follow the ambassador. As somebody who's been involved in working with, hopefully in a solidaristic way, the labor movement and the freedom struggle in South Africa since I was a child, it's just, I can't say what joy it gives me to be in this context, and particularly to the ambassador's call for a solidarity-based approach to trade and trading systems. And I understand there's very deep thought behind that one word, coming from the South African government, and so I want to just acknowledge those things before moving on to my prepared comments, which really are about the Biden trade agenda. What I thought it might be useful to do is to speak really just about what that agenda is and what that approach is, and I think I will touch on both Richard's points and the ambassador's comments in a variety of ways as I do that, and hopefully in the discussion we can get more into it. So let me begin with, President Biden's worker-centered trade policy is both an orientation and a set of specific policies. The orientation is twofold. It's both to the substance of trade policy and to process. The substantive orientation is to make, and I think we've heard sort of pleas for this kind of thing from both our previous speakers, but the substantive orientation is to make trade policy based on the question of what is the impact of any given trade agreement or trade policy on working people. And I would say, I think it's fair to say the president and his team asked that question both with respect to the United States and globally. The impact on working people measured by the impact on real wages and levels of employment and economic security, not on the stock market or the profits of companies that happen to be incorporated, say, in Delaware, rather than in Singapore or the Cayman Islands or Amsterdam or wherever. That the measure should be what the measure of trade policy should be its effect on working people, not on the profitability of particular segments of the global corporate community. And secondly, to understand, as the previous speaker said, trade policy as really economic integration policy. It's not a narrow, trade policy is not a narrow set of questions. It's fundamentally about the totality of the relationships between societies as they interact in the global economy. Now, if that's the substantive orientation, the process of the Biden policy is engaging with working people and their representatives, both in the United States and globally, when formulating trade policy. Engagement not as an afterthought or a pat on the head, but as a genuine process of upfront consultation. And if you look where Ambassador Tai, the United States Trade Representative, has been, places in the United States like Flint, Michigan, that previously have not been visited by trade officials, and who she has talked to, both in the United States and internationally, since her appointment, you will see that the ambassador takes this aspect, this consultative aspect of the president's policies very seriously. Substantively, beyond the overall approach, substantively, these new policies need to be understood as part of a broader approach to international economic policy, one that seeks to encourage the development of an international economic order that supports growth, rising real wages, and social stability. Points that were raised both by Richard and by the ambassador, and one that seeks, policies that seek to ensure that within that economic order, the United States has a viable and consistent strategy for our own broad-based prosperity, something that our government is really charged with doing fundamentally, as all governments are. Some key initial steps in this approach, which the American labor movement strongly supports, have been: one, embracing and strengthening the innovative labor rights and labor rights enforcement measures in the bipartisan USMCA agreement enacted under the previous administration. Two, getting serious about problems with forced labor and child labor in critical supply chains feeding the US economy, particularly in the renewable energy sector. Three, fighting for a meaningful global corporate minimum tax. And this goes to the point about economic integration. That corporate tax policy and trade policy need to be seen as essentially one and the same. The administration's position is currently that minimum needs to be 21%, which we think is credible, but still too low. The global labor movement seeks a minimum tax of 25. And finally, as the ambassador spoke to, supporting the expansion of SDRs at the IMF, and taking steps to support the large-scale shipment of COVID vaccines to the developing world. By the way, as the ambassador said, the labor movement believes that the United States has taken very important positive steps here, but needs to do more. And this is critical for the economic security of the world and for working people, that vaccines be available globally. None of us are safe until they are. Finally, the Biden administration insists that the WTO take labor issues seriously as part of its framework for global trade, starting with establishing a labor working group, as the WTO has done with other important non-tariff areas like environmental issues, which significantly shape the global trade environment. Now, the Biden agenda is sensible. That what I just went through is essentially the practical policy steps that have been taken by the Biden administration since the beginning of the year in support of its worker-centered trade agenda. Now, the Biden trade agenda is sensible from a theoretical perspective for some of the reasons that Richard talked about, but it is essential from a practical political perspective. When President Biden came into office, the very idea of a rules-based global economic order was under profound pressure. Pressure from, on the one hand, the Trump administration's direct attack on the very idea of such a system, and the former president's apparent desire to replace it with a system that that I can only characterize as ignorant armies clashing by night. And on the other hand, pressure from major actors such as China bent on simply ignoring the rules while professing to support them in areas ranging from steel dumping to forced labor. Underneath these pressures was the reality that the 1990s era neoliberal trade ideology had produced a global economic order that, as the UNCTAD paper shows, concentrated wealth, income, and economic power, and was politically unstable. Its fundamental feature was a race to the bottom on wages. Now, this neoliberal ideology was reflected both in the structure and behavior of the WTO during the last 30 years, and the templates that both the EU and the US were using essentially comprehensively for bilateral and multilateral agreements. And these templates set the pattern for such agreements among all nations. And to the extent anything different happened at the WTO, those bilateral and multilateral templates undercut any effort to go anyplace else. What the Biden worker-centered approach really is a return to the philosophy that animated the post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods agreements. The idea that international economic structures and policies must have democratic legitimacy, they must support broad-based global economic growth, and most of all, they must support rising real wages. The events of recent years should make it very clear that the alternative to President Biden's approach is not a return to the neoliberal mythology of the 1990s. Plan B is not the 1990s. Plan B is the 1930s. The rise of authoritarianism inside the world's major economies and strife among them. This is a moment when the need for global cooperation and coordination, and as the ambassador said, solidarity, has never been greater. COVID and climate change are all you need to say to make this point. But such cooperation and coordination are only possible on a foundation of democratic legitimacy. President Biden's worker-centered trade policy is a clear response to these situations that other governments and multilateral institutions should embrace and support. The alternative is truly terrible and all too easy to imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon. That was a helpful elucidation of Biden's policy, really taking us forward. Thank you. Tim, you're up.
Great, thank you. And it's a real honor to be on a panel like this with such distinguished speakers. Thanks to everybody at home for tuning in. So I'm going to focus my remarks on trade and climate. As many of you will be aware, the European Commission released its proposal earlier this year for a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has really kicked off a push to think about how countries are going to integrate climate more cohesively into trade policy. Rightfully, we've heard a lot during this webinar so far about COVID, but in many ways, climate represents, I think, an equal and perhaps longer term or potentially more likely to be with us for longer, hopefully, threat. So the European Union has long been a leader in trying to integrate climate into trade policy. The Biden administration has indicated an openness in moving in this direction. Candidate Joe Biden indicated support for a carbon fee or something like a carbon border adjustment of some kind. In some ways, the European Union moving forward with its CBAM has offered the administration an opportunity to think about how it wants to integrate its approach to a worker-centered trade policy with some of the climate imperatives that we face. I think all around the world, I think we're constantly seeing the effects of climate change in terms of significant weather events that are really disrupting people's lives. They're disrupting economic growth and development in both the developed and developing world. The time for action is probably was a long time ago, but it's, now is always the best time to get started. The European Union's CBAM proposal is slated, if all goes well in its domestic implementation process, to start coming online in 2023 with a sort of a gradual process from there, with 2026 being the next benchmark. And then the European Union has given free allowances to many of its industries for emissions, which would then be phased out over time from there. So the question is, how is the United States going to interface with this approach? The EU's CBAM tries in some ways to give countries credit for their own domestic efforts at carbon regulation. This is essentially required under WTO rules. So if you are going to impose basically, if you're going to try to treat products that are coming into your market even-handedly with domestic products, you need to be sure that what you are doing is in fact level. That is, you need to take account for any price of carbon that an import will have faced in its country of origin. So the EU CBAM does this by trying to basically give credit for explicit carbon pricing in the country of origin. At present, that doesn't actually do much for the United States. And I think perhaps it was a little bit of a surprise to at least some quarters of the Biden administration that the European Union didn't try to incorporate a credit for an implicit price of carbon that would arise from regulations that try to tackle the climate problem. The Biden administration's proposals in terms of the Build Back Better agenda have largely focused so far on a mix of regulatory approaches combined with subsidies. There's a lot to be said for regulation and subsidies as a domestic approach in the United States. We've sort of touched on some of these in the context of industrial policy. Subsidies seem like they are absolutely critical to jumpstarting progress in some of these industries that we both need in terms of addressing the climate problem, but also the nexus between climate and good jobs. And this is just another key feature of the climate proposal. Countries that are looking at addressing climate change are also looking at it as a way to provide good jobs for sectors of the economy that have been, to some extent, bypassed by the benefits of trade liberalization. And so you clearly see this in the Biden administration's approach, an effort to meld the environmental agenda and specifically the climate agenda with a jobs program. So the Biden administration has generally approached this from a regulatory point of view, seeking subsidies from Congress to further its agenda. We've now seen a different approach in the United States start to move forward. So the Senate Democrats, as part of the reconciliation bill, have begun to talk about a carbon tax. Some of the numbers that have been floating around would be a $15 per ton carbon tax. Remains to be seen whether or not that's something that can get through reconciliation. It's not something that the House has, in its efforts, has embraced as much as the Senate has. And of course, reconciliation in the Senate requires some very precise math. So whether it gets through or not, I think remains to be seen. But in some ways, I think we have sort of a twofold problem here. One is, what can the United States do politically to address the climate problem? And then how is that going to relate to these international issues, both multilateral issues that might come up at the WTO, as well as bilateral or plurilateral issues that are going to arise. And let me just, I'm mindful of the time, let me just say a couple things about that. From the standpoint of the WTO, these CBAMs all present pretty significant challenges, because trying to account for the cost of carbon in a foreign market, which I think the WTO rules would require you to do, is a pretty complicated process. And so doing that in a way that is going to be faithful to at least what the appellate body, when it was operating, told us was necessary, I think it is going to be a challenge. And I think this really requires us to rethink both the centrality of some of the strict non-discrimination norms that the WTO has applied via the appellate body, and it's I think inevitably going to be related to discussions about how to restart, if to restart, and how the appellate process at the WTO. These issues of policy space we're just going to have to recalibrate the degree to which we are going to essentially afford countries a margin of appreciation in tackling these issues. The second thing is that the WTO seems unlikely to be a forum in which we're able to negotiate a comprehensive approach to CBAMs. And so my colleague Todd Tucker at the Roosevelt Institute, he and I have proposed that we start transatlantically with a sectoral agreement that would focus on steel. In the first instance, there's going to be a learning curve in imposing these CBAMs. So there's a lot to be said for starting in sectors that are very trade exposed, that involve a lot of carbon, but that are not economy-wide. Sort of starting off with an economy-wide approach to carbon. And I think these minilateral, if you will, approaches are more likely to yield benefits in the time frame that we need to see, as opposed to a full-blown multilateral approach. And just the last thing I'll say is, a lot of countries now are talking about CBAMs, the UK, Canada, Japan. If every country adopts its own CBAM, you are likely to see sort of a multiplying sort of set of issues as each country does it a little bit differently, or maybe a lot differently. And so there really is a lot to be said for, I think, countries that have high ambition in the carbon area to adopt a common approach that would provide flexibility domestically, recognizing that countries are not in the same place, either as a legal or a political matter, in terms of the kinds of measures they're able to adopt domestically. Carbon taxes are one idea. Regulatory approaches such as the Build Back Better agenda, another idea. The European Union's cap and trade system, the emissions trading scheme, that's a third. All of those are valid approaches that should be permitted under any sort of plurilateral or multilateral framework. But a common approach to trading among high-minded, high-ambition countries, I think is likely to be a critical area in making any sort of CBAM approach sustainable in the long run. And so I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Tim. That was incredibly helpful, and then seeing the CBAM argument from the perspective of the U.S. is incredibly useful. We have just a few more minutes and several questions, and so I'll attempt to read a few questions and allow our panelists to respond to them as they're able. And hopefully wrap up rather quickly. The first question I'll bring to your attention is a question from Tufik Ali, who is a former ambassador of Bangladesh to Geneva. And he says, one of the strengths of the WTO is the dispute settlement system, and numerous trade agreements have taken the dispute settlement away from the WTO. For example, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S.-China Trade Agreement of 2020, and several others. The appellate body is in trouble. What do you see as the future of this segment of the WTO given this reality? Another question brought to our attention is by Yeronim Capaldo at UNCTAD, who is questioning specifically for Damon, and anyone else who wants to comment. The Biden administration is already facing pressure to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, especially after China asked to be admitted. How do you see this impacting a worker-centered agenda, and what do you think the American labor movement can or should do about this? And finally, a question on climate. So CBAMs and early action, this is from Kevin Gallagher, director of the GDP Center. CBAMs and early action in industrialized countries could have major spillover transition risks to developing countries, choking off exports and threatening balance of payments. This could have harsh impacts on workers and whole economies in developing countries. Do you think there is a political appetite for CBAMs to have a certain amount of the revenue go to developing countries to help them develop cleaner technologies to export to richer countries? And second, To what extent do you see political support for a TRIPS waiver that would spur green technology transfer and development? Without such a more international view, why should developing countries support these efforts? And what would such policies thus get ensnared as sort of a green protectionism? Any of you who would like to respond to those, we have about 5 minutes to wrap up our thoughts and comments on these. Go ahead.
Rachel, since there's one directly for me, very quickly, the AFL-CIO strongly opposes the United States entering into the TPP. It's a paradigm of neoliberal agreements that I think are discredited, and it would be extraordinarily politically destructive for the Biden administration to do so. Obviously, we have some experience with improving bad trade agreements. The USMCA is an example of one, but there is no sign of any meaningful effort on the part of the various parties to the TPP to do so. And I think that the discussions about that are frankly overblown. I would be profoundly shocked and surprised to see anything happen in that space.
I can say something about the climate issue just briefly. So, it certainly is the case that CBAMs have the potential to have the kind of effects on developing countries that Kevin suggests. I do think there's ways to ameliorate that. And I think ameliorating that in any sort of agreement among countries is likely to be critical. And this is actually another benefit of seeking an agreement among countries as opposed to a series of unilateral CBAMs. I think coordinating, redirecting some of the revenue from a CBAM into aid is much more difficult if every country is doing its own sort of unilateral CBAM. The Senate Dems are talking about redirecting some of the revenue to low and middle income folks here in the United States. So I could imagine in the context of an agreement that you would see countries sort of collectively trying to do that. I think there's also, we saw in the European Union's development of its proposal that they kind of went back and forth on the extent to which there was going to be an express carve out for developing countries. And I think ultimately they've sort of landed on the idea that there's not likely to be significant impacts on many developing countries, at least in the early years. Part of that is because part of that is because of the sectors that are covered. Part of it is just because their CBAM is a very slow moving train. And so, I think those effects in the early run are likely to be overblown. But I think absolutely it's the case that it's going to be critical to provide assistance to developing countries to move into green technology, again, both for the climate issues, but also for some of the labor issues and development issues that we've talked about. It's going to absolutely be something that we need to see occurring through these negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Maybe just a quick one, Rachel, on two issues. One, climate change and CBAM, as well as the appellate body. I think the starting point for us would be to ensure that trade measures that are taken to address climate change conform to members' WTO commitments. And we need to take care to ensure that measures that are implemented in the context of climate change do not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restrictions on international trade, because whether we like it or not, there will be those unintended consequences where developing countries will struggle to meet the standards and be able to continue to export their products. So there will need to be support that is provided to developing countries, including, as I said, a discussion on technology transfer, so that we find an effective way of supporting developing countries to adopt cleaner technologies. Mm-hmm. Then on the issue of the appellate body, I think what will be important is for at least MC12 to find a pathway. I don't think we will resolve this issue by MC12. It's correct that a number of even regional trade agreements have adopted a dispute settlement system similar to the WTO. The restoration of the two-stage dispute settlement system is absolutely important, and without an enforcement mechanism in the context of a dispute settlement system, developing countries will find themselves subjected to power dynamics. So a functional dispute settlement system is to the advantage of all, but also specifically developing countries. So we would want to see movement in this regard. But of course, I think given the limited time we have between now and MC12, it's not possible to think that it will be resolved, but at least MC12 must set a pathway that could provide a strategic direction in terms of how we are going to engage post MC12 towards a resolution of this issue. And whatever outcome that we finally have in terms of the restoration of the appellate body, I think what will be important is to address the concerns of all, including the concern of developing countries, especially the Africa group, around the accessibility of the dispute settlement system, including in relation to the costs. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Ambassador Mlumbi-Peter. It's so good to hear from all of you. Richard, did you want to have any closing remarks before we close?
Well, not really. I mean, just to go back to a point that Kalelwa made earlier, we have a real concern about the lack of trust in the multilateral system. I think she mentioned that. And whilst we have been tremendously encouraged by some of the willingness of advanced economies to break with the tropes of the last 40 years of neoliberalism, which, you know, is, and Damon went through some of those. What has been equally astounding to us is the level of, I wouldn't call it indifference, but the disconnect between the actual damage that developing countries have faced as a consequence of this crisis over the last 18 months, and the reluctance really to take a much franker and harder look at the way in which the multilateral system, both in trade and finance, have not delivered for developing countries over 40 years. And that disconnect, I guess we will get a sense of it over the next couple of months with the MC12 and then with the COP in Glasgow. But it's been quite discouraging, I have to say, given the challenge that developing countries face. There hasn't been that real embrace of a genuinely inclusive multilateral agenda for 15 months.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And thank you, Damon and Tim and Ambassador Mlumbi-Peter, for all of your participation today, for your sharing your thoughts and helping us tie these large ideas together into a coherent narrative. Thanks to all of you who were able to join our discussion online. This talk has been recorded on YouTube, and we will share the link for that in the chat. If you would like to receive updates on our publications or future events, you can subscribe to receive updates from our Global Economic Governance Initiative, and that will also appear in the chat. Thanks to you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Rachel, for your moderation too.